3 deals with placing limitations on property. Fancy word for limitation is an encumbrance. All right? That's all an encumbrance is. It's a limitation of some type on the property. It's something that limits what the current owner of that property can legally do. Said another way, it's something they would rather not have if they had their choice. Everybody would love to own real estate unencumbered, so to speak. But that's not, traditionally at least, the way most people do own real estate. Most real estate, or real property, or realty, or land, however you want to say it, remember they all mean the same thing, has certain restrictions on it. And so this chapter is all about those legal limitations and restrictions that we find in real estate. Right? So the first thing we want to do is sort of, again, define an encumbrance. It says it's a claim, charge, or liability that attaches to and is binding on real estate. It could be something like a charge, which we call a lien, so money that is owed, or just a straight up limitation on what the property can be used for. All of those things are examples of encumbrances. So liens, deed restrictions, lis pendens, easements, and encroachments. And this is just a list right here. We're going to go through each one of these individually, so I don't want to speak in detail about each one of them here. But these are the 5 main categories of encumbrances that we want to talk about. Right? Liens, biggest category of encumbrance. And once we get into this sort of material, I don't want you to lose sight of the forest for the trees, so to speak. In real estate classes, that's really easy to do because we spend so much time talking about the small, tiny little details of things that you lose the big picture. So let's talk about, first and foremost, what a lien is. Anybody want to give me their definition of a lien?
It's a claim that somebody else has against your property.
A claim that somebody else has against your property. A claim for what?
It depends on what the lien is for, but like a mechanics lien would be if somebody had done work for you that you didn't pay them. They
Okay.
put a mechanics lien against your property so that they can...
In order to obtain what?
Money.
Money. Money's the key word. A lien is a claim of money owed. And in order to protect that claim, the person placing the lien has put, it's almost like a hold on the property. They've said that when and if this property is sold, we want to guarantee that we get paid our money. Does that make sense for everyone? Now there's another word that comes into play immediately when we talk about liens. The dirty flip side of the coin of a lien. If you think of a coin as a heads or tails, well, the lien coin is heads on the lien side. The flip side of that, anybody want to guess what the flip side of that coin is? Foreclosure. The whole purpose of a lien is to have the ability to foreclose. One without the other is absolutely useless. You know, if you don't have liens, you don't have the ability to foreclose. If you don't have the ability to foreclose, there's almost no reason to place a lien. So that's what I mean when I say don't lose sight of the big picture. Ultimately, when we're placing a lien against a property, we're placing a threat of foreclosure. So what is foreclosure?
It's when your property gets repossessed.
It's when your property is repossessed. We call it repossession, like with cars and personal property, right? It's when and repossessed is a good way to think about it. It's sort of a misnomer because it's not being taken back by who you got it from. It's being taken back by whoever that lien property, and you're losing it, right? Exactly. It's taken away from you by somebody that you owe money to. And as Tracy said earlier, that somebody could be a mechanic, which we're going to talk about. That somebody, how about, could it be a bank that's loaned you money against the property? It could be a number of people or companies or entities that for some reason have the legal ability to take your property away from you. That's why they're placing that lien, because they want to have that threat of foreclosure. It doesn't necessarily mean they will foreclose. It just means they have the legal right to do so if they choose to do so. Okay? So there are two main categories of liens that we talk about here. The two main categories of liens that we mention right here are specific liens and general liens. Now, basically, one of these is about to disappear completely. Of these two up here, the specific lien and the general lien, if you look at those definitions, which one are we going to talk about in this class? Specific liens, and why?
Because it deals with.
Those are the ones that have to do with real estate. This is a real estate class, right? The second category, general liens, it says they attach to people. It's not that we don't care about them, but for purposes of this class, we don't care about them. Those are things like tax liens, and we don't mean property tax liens, we mean like income tax liens. Here's the difference between a specific lien and a general lien. In a general lien, the lien itself is attached to the person. That means that everything that person owns is subject to being taken to satisfy the lien. So if the IRS has a lien against you, can they take your house? Can they take your cars? Can they take your bank accounts? Yes, to all of the above. Whereas with specific liens, what can that lien holder take in order to satisfy that lien?
Property, the property.
That specific piece of property. And that's the key to a specific lien. It's not only that they can only take real estate, they can only take that one piece of real estate that that lien is attached to. I don't know why we have a sound effect here. I can't even.
Wow.
Fancy, right? Surprise even me. So, specific liens represent a legal right to foreclose. It only affects that particular property. Now, we call specific liens mortgages or deeds of trust. We're going to talk about as we go through the chapter a little bit, the differences between, actually, we won't talk about it until later on in the class in the finance chapters. But for your purposes right now, a mortgage and a deed of trust are the same thing. You might want to put an asterisk beside deed of trust, because in North Carolina, that's what the document is called. A lien on real property in North Carolina is called a deed of trust. We don't actually technically call it a mortgage here, even though that's what it would be called in a lot of other states. We call it a deed of trust. But it's the same thing. A mortgage and a deed of trust are both the same thing. They both place a lien against a piece of property for the purpose of securing a mortgage loan. Okay? And we also have some involuntary liens. A mortgage is a voluntary lien. You voluntarily, as the owner of the property, have given that lender the right to take it. Why would you voluntarily give the lender the right to take it?
So that you can get money.
So they will give you money. That's exactly right. If you don't give them the right to take your property, they don't give you the money. It's as simple as that. So we want to give, we voluntarily give up that right to the lender because we need their money. There's also involuntary liens, like tax liens. In this case, we're talking about real property tax liens. And we're going to talk specifically about those and then about mechanics liens as well. So mortgages and deeds of trust are voluntary, and they become a lien when the lender records the mortgage or deed or trust in the Register of Deeds office. And it says the borrower is giving the mortgage. And that's confusing. Remember when we started on Monday night, we talked about the OR and EE. If you flip back to that first slide we had and that list of things, the OR person is always the giver and the EE person is the receiver. Does everybody remember that?
Yes.
This one gets confusing because if I ask you who's giving a mortgage, your first reaction would be what?
The bank.
The bank. See, that's because in our mind the mortgage is the money. The mortgage is not the money. That's the loan. Okay? That's the note. The bank is giving the loan and giving the note. The mortgage itself is actually the promise of collateral. And who owns the property?
The homeowner.
The homeowner does. So who has the ability to pledge the property as collateral?
The homeowner.
The homeowner. So who's actually promising that if I don't pay, you can take my property?
The homeowner.
The homeowner. So since the mortgage is the promise, the mortgagor is going to be the homeowner or property owner if it's something other than a house, if it's, for example, a commercial property. Does that make sense for everybody? Because that can be confusing. Of all the OR and EE words, I find that mortgagor, mortgagee are the two most confusing. And trust me, they will throw that in there on a test to make sure that you can recognize the difference. They might not label bank. They may just say the mortgagee in a typical transaction, and you have to know the mortgagee is going to be who? The bank, because they're the ones receiving that promise. Good on that? All right. Mechanics liens, not this kind of mechanic. Not that kind of mechanic. Somebody who's providing a service, absolutely, but somebody who's providing a service on a piece of real property. We're talking about the kinds of mechanics like workmen who provide services on our property when we talk about mechanics liens. Now, this is North Carolina specific. And anytime you see this stuff that's North Carolina specific, like for example on page 48 in your book, if you look, almost everything on that page has that little gray flag out to the side. You see that, what it says?
Yes.
In North Carolina. They're highlighting that for a reason. Those are the things that when you prioritize your studying, you need to prioritize those things because those are the specific types of things that the Real Estate Commission likes to test for on that state-specific section. And usually, because they're North Carolina specific, they're more nitpicky, right? Because it's something that they said, okay, national law doesn't really address this specifically enough, so we need to have a separate law that governs this. And that's true in mechanics liens. Mechanics liens are the same from North Carolina to South Carolina to Connecticut to Alaska. But every state has different rules about how long you have to file a mechanics lien, how long you have to act on mechanics lien. Sometimes these are also called materialmen's liens. It's the same thing, a mechanics lien or a materialmen's lien. So in North Carolina, you have 120 days as a materialman or a mechanic to file this lien. 120 days after you've finished working on the property. Okay? Now that's a key time period. So starting on day one, after you finished your job, whatever your job, so if you are the electrical subcontractor, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to ask you something. Go ahead.
Yeah.
You might answer now.
If you're the electrical subcontractor working on a house, it's not 120 days from the time you started doing work or 120 days from the time you finished some portion. It's 120 days from the time you were completely done with your work on that property, whatever you contracted to do. So for an electrician, that means probably once the lighting is actually installed. If you think about a home, right? If you think of a home construction, they're going to come in, they're going to run the wiring, put the boxes in, put the breaker boxes in, and then once all the sheetrock's up, for example, then the electricians would come back and hang lighting and ceiling fans and actually put receptacles in the boxes and put the switches in and do all those kinds of things. So from that finished point, for whatever that person's been hired for, they have 120 days to go file this lien against the property. So basically what they're doing in filing that lien is they're saying, the owner of this property owes me money. And in order to protect myself and make sure I get paid, I'm putting myself in line to get paid when and if this property is either sold, that's a voluntary alienation, right? You talked about alienation on Tuesday night. Selling is a voluntary alienation. Or the property is foreclosed, which is what kind of alienation? An involuntary alienation. So we're saying, I want to get paid, and the way I can make sure I get paid is either have the property get sold and then I get paid, or the property be foreclosed and I get paid. And do I also have the ability to be the one doing the actual foreclosure? Yeah, because remember, a lien, what's the flip side of a lien? Foreclosure. Yes, ma'am.
So say you are the tile worker, say you're having your home built
Mm-hmm.
and you are the tile worker, and so the contractor hired you to do the tile work, not the homeowner,
Mhm.
and you pay, the homeowner pays the contractor, but the tile worker has not been paid, but when he places his lien, it is against the homeowner, correct?
Yes. Well, it's against the property.
Property, well, yeah.
Yes.
But the homeowner is responsible when they own the property.
Yes. Everybody understand her question? She's saying, you know, if I'm using a general contractor, because very often if when you hire someone to do work on your property, for example, or build a house or anything like
builder,
that,
that's hired.
you know, and the person that you've hired to complete the job is not going to do all the work. They're going to subcontract out bits and pieces. And in her specific question, she said, what about the tile work? You know, so my general contractor is probably not going to do tile work, him or herself. They're going to bring in somebody who specializes in tile work. And I have paid my general contractor, builder, whoever they are, for that portion of the job. Maybe I paid for the entire job,
Yeah, this happened with my parents.
and they don't, the general contractor doesn't pay the subcontractor. And her question was, can the lien still be filed against my property? And the answer is emphatically yes. As unfair as that sounds, it can and does happen. As a matter of fact, in 2008, when the market went very south very quickly, there was a Raleigh-based builder called St. Lawrence Homes. And there's still the St. Lawrence Homes building on Wake Forest Road. Actually, it's false, so the new stuff at that point. But St. Lawrence Homes was based in Raleigh, a regional builder, and they built mid to upper range homes. They were a tract builder, but in the $300,000 to $500,000 price range. So not small, insignificant houses. St. Lawrence Homes went bankrupt and went out of business. And one of the unfortunate realities of that was they were using the funds from closings to pay subcontractors after the fact. They did not have enough cash flow to pay the subcontractors before the homes closed. So the subcontractors were essentially letting them float that balance, and then once the home closed, they would pay all the subcontractors. Well, when they went out of business and they went bankrupt, in the weeks before they went bankrupt, they stopped paying their subcontractors. And people who closed on homes during that time had no idea that these subcontractors were not being paid. Now this goes back to our rule right here. How long does the law say that that subcontractor has to file a lien on the property? 120 days after they finish doing the work. So think about a new construction house. The electrician may finish their work a week or two before closing, right? Because they're coming back at the very end when the power's finally connected and they're doing the final work. So they've just finished their work, the house closes, you borrow $400,000 and you pay St. Lawrence Homes $400,000 and the house is yours. And then 3 weeks later, when the subcontractor hasn't gotten paid, what do they go do? They go file a mechanics lien against the property. And it happened routinely after that. And there were people who found themselves with hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of mechanics liens against their brand new homes. And some of them it took years to unwind those issues because they couldn't sell their home because they had all these liens attached to it. It was a mess. It was an absolute mess. So one of the things that we do now, which is not 100% foolproof, but is better, and we've sort of learned from that mistake, is we have sellers now in North Carolina sign what's called a lien waiver. And we have the contractors who have done work on the property sign a lien waiver before closing that basically gives up their right to file a mechanics lien. It says, quite simply, either I've been paid or if I haven't been paid, I'm giving up my right to file a lien against the property, and basically will take that up with the seller about getting paid. So it's some protection for the buyer that this will not happen after closing. So there's a lesson there for you as a broker, real world lesson. Forget the book for just a second. The real world lesson there is you should always be on the lookout for new things in a property that you're selling. If you take a buyer out to a house and it's a flip, for example, and you see a brand new HVAC system sitting out there, and you see new appliances, new flooring, new this and new that, before I close, I want to see paid invoices. I want to see one of two things: either invoices showing those things have been paid for, or I want to see the invoices being paid out of the closing itself. I would love to see the invoices being paid out of the closing itself, because then we have very vivid proof that those debts have been satisfied. Does that make sense for everybody? Your exact question.
Oh, we found out about it. It's because it was the day we were moving in. We went in and all the bathroom tile had been hit with sledgehammers.
Oh, that's interesting. Now, I will not say that is not within their legal right.
But that's how we found out about it.
Sounds like there was a hole, kind of a hole in the wall there.
How do you mean?
Well, I mean, obviously the builder in that situation is kind of where it imploded.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, a buyer of a home, like you said, they're not suspecting that at all.
Correct. And that's where you get into the basic idea of real estate in North Carolina. And again, this is where things vary from state to state, but the basic idea of real estate in North Carolina is something called caveat emptor, which means, quite literally, let the buyer beware. North Carolina law, whether we like it or not, places the emphasis for such things on the buyer. It simply says, as the buyer, it's up to you to be satisfied. Now, here's the truth of the matter. A really prudent and careful buyer could completely protect themselves from that kind of a situation. In theory. I could write a contract with a closing date more than 120 days from the day I make the offer. And as long as the property hasn't had any work done from the time I made the offer to the time I close, do I care if those debts have been paid? Why? Why would that be important?
Because they no longer have a legal right.
They no longer have the legal right to place that lien because that time has lapsed. Does that make sense? So and I'm not discounting your point at all, but that's sort of the point counterpoint, right? You know,
right.
If you're defending the way that North Carolina has structured things, which I'm not necessarily, they would say, wait 120 days. You know, wait it out. It's only 4 months.
Right.
And and the reality is, not many sellers want to wait 4 months to try
this market.
Not in this market, absolutely not. But if somebody really were wanting to protect themselves completely, they would simply wait, 120 days from the time they make the offer to the time they close, and verify that the home's in or the property. I always say home. I need to make sure to say property because it could be commercial property as well, right? Make sure the property's in the same condition as when you made the offer to the time you close, and then you are 100% assured that there's not going to be a mechanics lien placed against that property because you've waited out that sort of deadline. Okay?
Now, I have one more question, and I might be missing something, so forgive me, guys.
That's
so
okay.
Say it doesn't get settled, so he wants to take the house into foreclosure. But just for that loan, what if it's not? I mean, that lien, no matter how small it is,
Yes.
takes the house into foreclosure.
Absolutely. But hold on to that question, because we're going to talk about something called lien priority. And lien priority is going to dictate the order in which those liens are placed. And so the short answer to your question is, yes, no matter how small and insignificant that lien is, for $300 I can foreclose on that home. But because we place certain priority on certain liens getting paid first, it may not be, if I have such a small lien and I'm so far back in line, it may not be in my interest to foreclose on that property. Okay? All right? Now, there's also another number here you have to memorize when it comes to mechanics liens, and that's 180 days.
For the foreclosure.
That's exactly right. Leanne said for foreclosure, and that's exactly right. in order to enforce the lien, and that's a fancy way of saying foreclose. If this mechanic, materialman, wants to actually foreclose on the property, they have a limited amount of time to do so. Whereas somebody with a mortgage lien, for example, or a deed of trust, they have an unlimited duration of time to foreclose. They can foreclose at any time until the lien is satisfied or released. But a mechanic or materialman only has 180 days
Is that from the beginning?
from the
the day of
end.
work.
From the end again. So 120 days to file the lien, 180 days to actually foreclose or enforce the lien. And those periods of time are running simultaneously. Okay? So basically, if they don't move to foreclose within that 180-day time period, they are sitting waiting for the owner to decide to do something themselves or for some other lien holder to foreclose. But they don't have the ability to force that action anymore. Fair enough? Okay. So 120 days to file the lien, 180 days to enforce the lien. Now, if it goes past 180 days, it doesn't mean their lien goes away. Their lien will still stay there. It just, now they don't have the ability to foreclose on the property anymore. So they really only have 6 months where they can actually foreclose on the property. All right? Now, what are the effects of a specific lien on the property? Number one, they are pertinent. Specific liens are very much a pertinent lien. What do we say that a pertinent word meant? It runs with the land. Tell me what that means.
But no matter who owns it, it's attached to it.
Yes, no matter who owns the property,
It stays
we don't
with it.
care. The lien, the thing that's appurtenant, stays with the property, stays with the land,
So
right?
if someone's willing to buy it with a lien, they take over the lien.
Yes. Leanne says, so if somebody's willing to go through with that purchase and buy it with a lien still attached to it, then they can do so, but now they're responsible for the lien. Well, maybe they're not completely responsible. It doesn't magically, like in the case of a mortgage loan, for example, they don't actually owe the money.
Right.
It's still the person who signed the note that owes the money. And in the case of a mechanic's lien, they don't actually owe the HVAC company, for example. It's the person who hired the HVAC company that owes them the money. But that's a difference without a distinction. Or I never know what that expression is. Is it distinction without a difference or difference without a distinction? I guess it works either way, right? But that's a way of saying that it doesn't really matter if they personally owe the money, because they personally have the most to lose, because it's their property that's tied up with this lien, right? So while they might not be responsible for the repayment of that debt, they are subject to lose their property if that debt's not paid. So in the best interest of the buyer, what would you want to do about all liens before you take over title to the property?
Make sure that it's settled.
Make sure they've been settled. And we do title searches for that sort of thing, to look for those liens ahead of time. Okay? So this is that priority thing I was talking about. And priority simply means, who do we pay first? Who gets paid first? This is on page 49 in your textbook. Liens have a certain priority that the state gives them. This is not up to the borrower, it's not up to the lenders, it's not up to any of us. It's the state who set up this sort of pecking order and said that liens, some are more important than others. And the ones that are more important than others are going to get paid first. Now, if you're the state and you're making the rules and you're saying certain liens are more important than others, what lien do you put at the top of that list?
State tax.
Taxes. Taxes are money that you owe to the government, right? And they are a specific lien that attaches to the property, so they are always first in this sort of list of who gets paid first. Taxes, and then something called special assessments. And we're going to talk about special assessments and what those are. But that's also money that you owe to the government. So any money you owe to the government goes at the top of the list. Taxes and special assessments, they get their money first. And here's the interesting thing. It doesn't matter who processes the foreclosure, for example. So if that HVAC installer, who never got paid, forecloses on the property, they did all the work, they had to pay an attorney thousands of dollars to do the foreclosure, are they going to get paid first?
No.
No, who they're gonna have to pay first out of the proceeds?
The state.
The state, the county, the city, any taxes that are owed on the property. And then who gets paid next?
Bank.
The banks, plural maybe, right? And the mortgages, if there's more than one, in the order that they're recorded. How many of you have ever heard the expression first mortgage, second mortgage? Right? Really all that means is which one's recorded first. Because in North Carolina, we practice what's called a pure race system. It's like a race to the courthouse, right? And what that means is that the first mortgage to get recorded gets paid first. The same thing with any lien within a category. So when you talk about mortgages, mortgages are paid in the order they're recorded. When you talk about mechanics liens, they're paid in the order they're effective. They have a certain order where they get paid. Does that make sense for everybody?
So if somebody's house goes into foreclosure because of real estate property tax.
Yep.
And you can buy the house for whatever they owe on the tax.
Yep.
We'll say it's $500.
Mm-hmm.
What happens to all the other, I mean, I know they're still attached to the property, but how do they get satisfied?
That's an interesting question. She said, what if a foreclosure action takes place and
Let's just
they're...
really set it up. Let's just say that, can we set it up a little further back?
Sure.
So say I bought a house that's $500,000 and I took out a loan to buy it and I still owe the bank $400,000.
Yep.
And I didn't pay my property tax.
Yep.
And then what she says goes into play.
The tax man forecloses.
Right.
Yep. Here's the interesting thing about a foreclosure.
And she buys it in foreclosure.
She buys it in foreclosure from the tax man, so to speak.
$500.
That's
On
my
the
being able to say.
courthouse steps.
On the courthouse steps, right?
I've always wanted to do that, but I didn't do it the rest of
The interesting thing about foreclosures is that whatever level the foreclosure takes place at, the liens below it disappear with the foreclosure sale. Okay? They're not protected. Anybody ahead of them has the right to foreclose, and they're sort of naked at that point
So
in
what happens
time.
to the mortgage to the bank?
They don't get paid, necessarily. Well, they would get paid so let's say it's a $500,000 house and she owes $10,000 in taxes. Well, if the county forecloses and it sells for $100,000 on the courthouse steps, the county's going to get their $10,000, and they're going to get whatever money it costs them to process the foreclosure. That's called the cost of the sale. And then whatever's left over is going to go to whoever's next in line. So here's how that happens in reality. You want to hear the reality of that situation? Who's never going to leave the taxes unpaid in that case? The lender, right?
Oh, yeah.
The lender's never going to leave the property taxes unpaid because it puts them in that situation. What would happen in a situation like that is the lender would step up and pay the property taxes because they would never want to be at risk of losing that asset. They're not going to risk losing a $500,000 asset because of a $10,000 property tax bill. That's sort of cutting off their nose to spite. Now, that doesn't mean it doesn't happen sometimes. Lenders make mistakes too. They have goop ups and paperwork gets crossed up, and it happens. But it's very rare. It's very rare. And even one of the more interesting things, if you want to really talk about the real world and how foreclosures work, one of the more interesting things is that when the most common foreclosure is the mortgage foreclosure, right? If somebody doesn't pay their mortgage, the bank forecloses on the property. Those properties are usually sold on the courthouse steps, even though it doesn't look like they really are. It looks like they're put on the market and they're marketed by a real estate broker, and they are eventually. But guess who buys it on the courthouse steps? The same lender who foreclosed on it in the first place. And they go through that process for a number of reasons. Number one, state law says you have to sell it through a trustee's sale once you foreclose. So the trustee has to place it for sale or auction at the courthouse, number one. Number two, the lender always wants to take a chance that maybe somebody will show up at that auction and pay enough to satisfy their lien. And if somebody happens to bid enough to satisfy their lien, they will let it go at the courthouse steps. But there's no risk for them in bidding on their own loan, so to speak, on the courthouse steps. If they're owed that $400,000 and the high bid is $200,000, they're going to step in and they're going to offer $400,000. Well, if somebody outbids them, they'll let it go because now they're getting all their money.
Right.
If somebody doesn't outbid them, the $400,000 goes to the courthouse and comes
Back to them.
right back to them. Costs them nothing. Does that make sense
Yeah,
for you?
absolutely.
And now they have title to the property, so they can do whatever they want to with it as far as marketing it. They can fix it up, they
Right.
can list it with a real estate broker, they could rent it out. Some, some do that, which is what SECU does with, does that sort of make sense about how the real world foreclosure process
Yeah.
plays out? Most of the time, those lenders buy back their own assets, so to speak, at the foreclosure
Well,
auction.
let's say somebody had owned their house for 30 years and stopped, for whatever reason, paying taxes.
Yeah.
Then you would buy it for whatever the taxes.
Whatever the taxes, because there's no incentive, if it's the taxes that are foreclosing, they don't have any incentive to get more than the taxes that are owed, right?
Right.
They can't keep it.
They can't keep it, because any excess, they're not allowed to keep. You're not allowed to sort of have a windfall as a result of a foreclosure. You're allowed to be made whole, and being made whole means you can collect the amount you're owed and any interest on that amount and any penalties that you're due, and then you can recoup the amount of what it costs you to foreclose, because foreclosure is an expensive process. You got to pay a lot of attorneys, you got to go through the filing process, and all that sort of thing. So for a tax foreclosure, if that's why it's being foreclosed on, well, the county has no motivation to collect more than what they can keep. So they're going to let it go as soon as it gets above that number. Whereas the lender very much has motivation to pay above and beyond that number. So in most cases, the lender's going to be bidding it up, so to speak. They're going to be bidding it because they're trying to drive somebody else to get the number high enough to where their loan gets satisfied. Make sense for everybody?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so that's the lien priority. Real property taxes and special assessments get paid first, and then mortgages in the order that they're recorded, and then finally our mechanics liens at the very end. So to go back to your question of, can somebody foreclose if they have that $500 mechanics lien? Yes, but the question they have to ask themselves is there going to be enough money left over after I foreclose to make this worth my while? Because I'm going to have to dedicate thousands of dollars to the foreclosure process, because I've got to go out and hire an attorney to send out all the necessary mailings and file the foreclosure documents and that's got to be paid in advance.
Right.
And it may take me 6 months to work through this foreclosure process. And once I do foreclose, now I've got to market the property, and once I market the property, I have to hope I sell it for enough to be able to cover any taxes that are owed, any
Right.
mortgages that are owed, and then get my money plus what I spent for the foreclosure out of it. And it's just a very uphill battle
Absolutely.
in most cases. So usually what happens with mechanics liens is they go past that 180 days that they can actually enforce, and they just sit there and they wait for you to do something on your own. And then they can rear their ugly head 20 years down the road or 5 years down the road when somebody wants to sell their house. Like, wait a minute, you got this mechanics lien out here that you never paid, and you owe them X amount of dollars.
So then you just hold on to your house for 30 years and it goes off. the
That's
title.
right. When you talk about the marketable
Or your
title act,
parents
you wait
and
for 30 years.
Builder
Yes.
go at it.
Because then
Yes.
you have to go back 30, right?
Yes, ma'am, that's right. Yes, ma'am, Mr. Brown.
Does interest accrue on mechanics liens or any type of lien?
It can. And it really, her question was, does interest accrue? It can, and that really depends on how the contract with that service provider was originally written. You'd have to have a contract that said specifically, if you don't pay us, it's going to accrue penalties and fees and that sort of thing. So a smart contractor will always have a contract that's been looked at by an attorney that protects them in that way, because otherwise you'd be looking at just that stagnant amount of money. Okay? Deed restrictions. So we moved past liens. Deed restrictions are another type of encumbrance. These are things that are attached to the ownership of the property, your estate in the property, that limit what you can do with the property. An example would be your homeowner's covenants, and we're going to talk about those in detail in Chapter 6, which is the land use control, but those are also examples of encumbrances. They're limitations on the use of the property, and we're going to get into a lot of detail about those in Chapter 6, so just kind of introduce them here, but they are indeed an encumbrance. on the property, okay? The lien pendants, and I know it looks like list pendants, but it's lien pendants, which is in your book on what, page 50, I think?
50.
On page 50, you have the lien pendants. So a lien pendants, and then on the next slide says a writ of attachment. I'm going to talk about these two things together because they really go hand in hand. The difference is one is practiced in North Carolina and one is practiced in other states, but they have the same net effect. The lien pendants is the one that happens in North Carolina. Other states use a writ of attachment. But they both have the same function. Here's what the function is: to stop any sale of the property. Why? Why would we want to stop a sale? Well, what was that? I'm sorry.
Because of the liens against it.
Well, she said because of the liens against it.
Is it kind of like all those people who own the property that's near where they want to put the rest of,
540?
540?
Not quite, not quite. Here's what we're concerned with a lien pendants or a writ of attachment. The owner of that property is being sued. And depending on the outcome of that lawsuit, the property may have a lien placed on it. You know, so if I'm suing the owner of a piece of real estate, and if I win my lawsuit, I'm going to be or could be awarded a lien against the property. We have to give buyers warning of that. Otherwise, as soon as somebody was being sued, what would they do? They'd run out and sell the property and think, I don't give a crap if I do lose this suit because it's somebody else's to have the lien to deal with. Does that make sense?
So there's no loan against the property yet, but there could be depending a lawsuit. And if you were to sell the property and didn't have this, then the person who bought the property after the lawsuit happens could automatically have a lien.
Have a lien on their property. That's exactly right. Everybody hear what she said? That there's no lien. You didn't hear. Okay, I'll repeat it for you. She said there's no lien against the property right now. But if I buy the property and the owner loses this lawsuit that's going on because they're being sued, then I could end up with a lien slapped against my property after I've already closed on it, after I've purchased it. Because the lawsuit was going on and wasn't resolved at the point in time I purchased the property. You follow that? So it's a warning to the buyer saying, don't do this. Stupid.
Now
Right.
this isn't automatically done. You have to file this?
You have to file this, number one. Number two, here's the real difference between a lien pendants and a writ of attachment. A lien pendants doesn't stop the sale. It just says to the buyer, you're crazy stupid if you do this.
Who files it?
Who files it? It would be
The person.
the person who's filing the lawsuit.
Okay.
Person who's filing the lawsuit would usually file it. Sometimes the court does it automatically. Okay? Whereas a writ of attachment actually says you can't sell this property until this
It's
suit
done.
is done.
Right.
But the net effect is the same because nobody in their right mind is going to buy a property with a lien pendants attached
Right.
to it. All right, is everybody good on those? Okay. Easements. Easements are in your book starting on page 51. There are two categories of easements that we're going to talk about. And an easement is the right to use somebody's property other than your own. It's not ownership. This is not taking over ownership of somebody's property. It's having the right to access or utilize somebody else's property for your own benefit.
Like your driveway, you have to cross someone else's property to get out.
If my driveway crosses somebody else's property, that's an example of an easement, for example. Time Warner Cable having their wiring running across my front yard is an example of an easement. I had a young lady in class one time, and I shouldn't pick on her. She's long since gone, so I will. And she said, I don't understand why the developer in my neighborhood was so stupid. And I said, well, what do you mean? It's like, it gave away all these stupid easements, and it makes everybody's life miserable because we can't put fences up in our backyard because we have this stupid easement from Duke Power back there. I said, I know, stupid developers are wanting to have electricity at the house. Gosh, why would they want to do that? She said, what do you mean? I said, well, you know, they don't fly the electricity in there, right? It's not a wireless thing. They have to get it there somehow. You know, she said, well, they could have put them up on poles in the air. I said, well, what if it breaks? They still have to have access, right? They got to drive a truck out there, and somebody's got to get in a cherry picker and go up and fix the thing. Whether it's underground or above ground, they need the ability to access your property. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yeah.
You know, water, sewer. Why do you give up those easements? Because the trade-off is you won't have utilities if you don't. I mean, I suppose if you want to have solar panels and a well and septic, or you want to be out there with a hand pump, or you have no easements. But those of us who like to live not in the dark ages, give me my easements any day, right? Now, of course, that's not always a fun thing. You know, you may come home and find a big truck in your backyard. You know, you may come home and find a section of your fence taken down because you've put a fence in the same place where they have their easement. And if you did that and they have an emergency, they have the right to take it down.
And they do not have to put it back up.
And they do not have to put it back up because you should have known that that area was protected by that easement. And they have a right to use it as they see fit. Just as you have a right to use it as you see fit. But just like they're not responsible for what you do, you're not responsible for what they do, and vice versa. Make sense? So easements are not ownership, but they're grants of use of a property. Now again, go back to who can grant that permission. We talked about this with sort of deed restrictions, the idea, who can give that permission to somebody for an easement?
The owner of the property.
The owner of the property. That, at some point, it always goes back to some owner of the property saw some benefit in giving away, or maybe even selling, this access. Sometimes it's selling. An example of an easement you might sell. If you have railroad tracks, and the railroad company comes and maybe they own the tracks themselves, but they don't want to buy this narrow strip of land where the tracks run through. They may just purchase an easement for the tracks. There's actually a funny story about that in Western North Carolina. In Western North Carolina, this attorney, it would be an attorney, right, bought a piece of property several years ago, and in doing his own title search before he bought the property, and this was like a hunting reserve that he bought, there's railroad tracks that go across the back of the property, and it's CSX tracks. Well, what he found was that the easement belonged to a defunct or non-existent corporation that was an old railroad that no longer existed. And so he researched and he found that CSX had, you know, swallowed up this company over the years, but they had never actually transferred the easements over. In other words, CSX did not have a valid easement on his property where the railroad tracks were located. So this guy, in his infinite, he was an attorney after all, he buys one of these buildings at Home Depot that you just get delivered. You know, you can pay a couple $1,000s and they bring it out on a truck. And they said, where do you want it? I want it right there on those tracks. They said, are you crazy? He said, no. And he had it put right in. So that afternoon when the freight train comes through, of course the freight train has to stop out there, and they end up with the sheriff's department and the, people from the railroad commission and all that. And they get out there and they research and they find out, sure enough, CSX does not have any legal access to this 4-mile stretch of track, which goes through his property and about a dozen other properties. And he looks directly at the CSX representative and he says, but I'll sell you an easement. I bet he was in pretty good shape after that. What do you think? What do you think that easement's worth to CSX at that point in time?
And the 200 feet on either side of the track.
That's exactly right. And the other people all along that way, I'm sure there were a lot of thank you notes that went out.
I bet. They probably had this as a party.
And what do you want to bet? He represented all of them in that process. So, yeah, I mean, funny things happen with easements, but it's the right to use someone else's property. So the first category of easement we want to talk about is the appurtenant easement. There's our favorite word again, right? Appurtenant. What does that mean?
Attached to.
Attached to the land. Permanent. It means that the easement itself goes with the property. The easement benefits a piece of property. It doesn't benefit a person. I don't have the benefit of an appurtenant easement. My property has the benefit of an appurtenant easement. Well, if the benefit goes with the property, what happens if I sell the property?
It goes with,
Stays with the property.
It stays with the property, so do I get the benefit any longer?
no.
No, the new owner gets the benefit of the property. That's an appurtenant easement. Here's the key to an appurtenant easement, or one of the keys. It's always two pieces of property. Yes?
Go ahead.
Okay. It's always two pieces of property, and they're always side by side. They're always adjacent to one another. They share at least one boundary. Appurtenant easements always involve two pieces of property. They always share a boundary with one another. And we end up with what we call a dominant tenement. That's the one that takes advantage of the situation, the piece of property that takes advantage, and the servient tenement. And the servient tenement is the one that is being used or being taken advantage of. So where do you think, because the easement is the right to use, where do you think the easement is located? On the dominant tenement or on the servient one?
Servient.
It's on the servient one. The easement itself is located on the servient tenement. That's exactly right. Go ahead.
Okay, so if you have lot A and B side by side, and lot A is on the right, and lot B is the servient who grants lot A, the dominant,
Yep.
right to cross their property for a driveway.
Mm-hmm.
When they grant that easement, are easements allowed to be, for instance, timed so that they don't, so like, I grant you this easement to use my property as long as you own your property or your lifetime?
If they do, then that would not be an
An easement.
appurtenant easement.
Right,
Appurtenant
okay.
easement would be an easement in gross.
Okay,
Because anytime the benefit is tied to some person, then that's going to be an easement in gross.
okay, and what about if it's like a, just a time frame? We'll allow you to do this.
Can't do a time frame.
Okay.
It's either a person or a property.
Okay,
And if it's a property, it's forever.
okay,
And if it's a person, it's limited by that person's lifetime.
okay.
All right? So here's a very crude drawing example of an appurtenant easement. Two pieces of property side by side. And we've got a shared driveway. Here's the highway or road over here. Here is the driveway, and it continues on to here. Well, the dominant tenement is the one that doesn't have direct access to the roadway. The dominant tenement is the one who's utilizing the servient tenement. Does that make sense for everybody? Now, who has to maintain this portion of the driveway? The
Servient.
servient does. Not only do they have to give up use of their property, they have to do the maintenance on that shared piece of property as well. So it's definitely an interesting dynamic at play. Now, keep in mind how this came into being, because again, we don't want to lose sight of the big picture. How this happened is that this, at one point, was one piece of property. It was what we call subdivided. Subdividing is just dividing a piece of land into two or more pieces of land. So at some point, this used to be all one. And somebody subdivided this property, and they realized, wait a minute, we need access back to the road. How are you going to have a lot back here if you can't access the road? So part of that subdivision was to create this easement. Because remember, who can place restrictions on the property? The owner. So when the owner of this one big piece of land subdivided the whole thing, they created that easement because they needed it. Right? Easements in gross are still use. You're giving away use of the property, but instead of giving it away to a piece of property, instead of having a dominant and a servient tenement, we simply have a servient tenement. There's only a servient tenement because now the beneficiary is a person or an entity. If it's a person, the easement's going to last until the death of that person. If the easement belongs to an entity, we normally call those utility easements. So, you know, for example, when I talk about CSX and that easement, or Duke Power, or Time Warner Cable, or Google Fiber, or the Town of Cary for water and sewer, all those are examples of easements in gross. The key to an easement in gross is it's going to go away at some point. Now, I know that gets to be confusing when you start talking about utility easements, because utility easements seem to last forever. But in theory, if Duke Power ever went out of business, what would happen to all their easements?
They'd go away.
They'd go away. They'd go away because their easements in growth. Yes, Nancy.
I have a question.
Yep.
I'm not sure exactly what kind of easement or whatever it was, but my grandparents lived on a plot of land that was accessible only by a really long dirt path, and there was 4 other people behind them that also had to use this path. And the owner of the land at the very front didn't live down the path that lived next to the road. The land that the path was on belonged to them, and they refused to grant easement. And the government had to get involved and said that these people had to have a way to get to their land.
Yep.
I'm not exactly sure what was that.
What was that? It's called an easement by necessity. An easement by, which is coming up in one of the next screen. An easement by necessity is a function of the law. It's an easement that the state steps in and creates exactly in that situation, because the state law is that you can't create a landlocked piece of property. Now, what are you going to get there? A helicopter? You know, you have to have access to a public right-of-way, a public roadway of some type. And so as a property owner, you're never allowed to create a situation that landlocks a piece of property. And if it's found after the fact, because it does happen, you know, sometimes it slips by the county when a property's being subdivided and you create this landlocked situation. If you think about it, landlocked doesn't make sense. How do you access it, right? There's no way to access it without trespassing on somebody else's property. You need an easement to get access to the property. And so the state calls that an easement by necessity. And what they actually do in that situation is they start looking back in time at the subdivisions. And they go back far enough to when all of that was one property. So you said it was like 4 lots that were behind it. They would go back to far enough back in time to when that was all one big piece of property. And they would say, okay, at the first subdivision, an easement should have been created here. And at the second subdivision, that easement should have been continued here until they've worked their way all the way back out, such that every one of those pieces of property has legal access to a roadway. That's an easement by necessity.
Can I ask you a question backing up?
Yeah.
By growth? And it says in the last one, it says, personal involves are not inheritable and not assignable.
Yes.
Okay, so like if it's commercial, like Duke Power owns the easement across your land. If they get bought out by somebody else, does the easement go? I mean,
It does not, because that's not a personal easement.
Okay.
They can transfer their easements.
Okay.
They can transfer. So that's the differentiation between a personal easement in gross and a utility easement in gross. If the beneficiary is an entity, a company, corporation, LLC, they are allowed to transfer the benefit of that easement sort of indefinitely. Whereas a personal easement in gross, so like for example, let's say I'm selling my granddad's farm and I still want the ability to fish on the pond on the farm. I could reserve an easement, a personal easement for me to go fishing on that pond. Well, that easement would last until my death, because that's a personal easement in gross. I couldn't sell that benefit to anybody. I couldn't give it away to anybody. It doesn't go to my heirs. It's just me. That's a personal easement in gross. But if we grant an easement in gross to something like a utility company, for example, they can transfer it on to any subsequent iteration of that entity. You know, as that entity changes hands and becomes bigger or smaller or whatever, and changes names, merges with other companies, that easement's going to continue to follow along. Okay? And so here's a picture of property that might have both. It might have both an easement and an easement in gross. In fact, most properties all have easements in gross, because there's going to be some type of utility easement on almost every property. The appurtenant easement is a little bit more rare. This is an example of property that has both. Obviously the servient tenement down here, because it has the shared portion of the driveway. This is the dominant tenement, but they both have easements in gross for that railroad track in the back. How do we create an easement? Well, the first way we create an easement is something called an express grant. And here's the thing. They say express grant or express reservation. Here's the only difference. Remember, the only person who can create an easement is the owner of the property, right? So the owner of the property is creating this easement, And they're deciding which property do I want to sell and which property do I want to keep, because they're subdividing their property. Make sense for everybody? So which property do I want to sell and which property do I want to keep? If I'm selling the property, the servient tenement where the easement is located, that's called an express reservation, because I'm selling Tracy the property, but I'm reserving the right to use this easement. Does that make sense for everybody? So if I'm selling the servient tenement, it's an express reservation. If I'm selling the dominant tenement, it's an express grant, because if I'm selling the dominant, that means I'm keeping what? The servient.
It's the opposite, okay.
Yeah, express reservation is the developer keeps the dominant tenement, right? They keep the dominant tenement, so they're reserving the right to use the easement that's located on the servient one, which they just sold. Whereas in an express grant, I'm keeping the servient tenement, so I'm granting permission for somebody to use my property, whoever I sell the dominant to. We already talked about the easement by necessity with Sabrina's question.
Can I take that away?
Can you take what away?
The one like with Sabrina, when the state comes in and grants it, but what about when that property sells?
It's going to stay, because it's an appurtenant easement. An easement by necessity is an appurtenant easement. It stays there forever. Okay? The easement by prescription. How many of you remember us talking about adverse possession? Remember that? If you basically take and have somebody's property and use it like your own for 20 years. And what was the little mnemonic thing that we used to remember that with? Does anybody remember that?
Ocean.
Ocean. You have to use it openly, continuously, for at least how long? At least 20. Forget that color title thing. At least 20 years. Openly, continuously for at least 20 years. Exclusively means I'm the only one using it, right? It has to be adverse to the best interest of the real owner, and it has to be notorious, which means without their permission. And if I do all that, then I can make a claim to actually take their property. Well, in the same way, I can make a claim to take an easement. So like, for example, if I've been accessing this property for the last 20 years, if I've been hunting on this property for 20 years, and I'm the only one who does it, and I've never been told to stop. I mean, I've got my own little hunting blind set up on their property. There's a path from my property to their property. If I do that for 20 years, I could actually go make a claim that would grant me an easement to use that property. It would give me a legal right to an easement. You don't have to really remember the ways to terminate an easement. One of the ones I would pay attention to, though, oops, wrong button, is this merger. When you have appurtenant easements, remember they're two side-by-side properties, right? Well, you can't have an easement over yourself, so to speak. So if the same party ends up owning both properties, the easement goes away. When we talk about terminating easements, one thing to keep in mind is that non-use is not necessarily abandonment. If you happen to see that in a test question, you don't ever just automatically assume that an easement's gone away. You have to go to court to get one of those eliminated. So you have to prove abandonment, and it's more than just non-use. Right? A license is basically just permission. Temporary permission to use somebody else's property. It's different from an easement, because an easement is more permanent, and an easement is recorded. It becomes part of the recorded documentation for the property. It gets put on the plat map so that any potential buyer can see it. Whereas a license is just permission. You can park your car in my driveway. You can hunt on my land. It's just temporary permission, and because it's temporary permission, it can be given or taken away at any point in time. That's a license. Now, an encroachment is when some improvement, what's an improvement?
Like fences or.
A fence, what else? A garage, anything that's constructed, right? Anything that's constructed or built, when an improvement crosses the property line onto another piece of property, we call that an encroachment. And an encroachment actually makes both pieces of property unmarketable. So encroachments are very bad things. And the primary purpose of a property survey is actually to look for encroachments. That's why you would recommend to your clients that they have a survey before they purchase a property so that they can make sure there are no encroachments onto their property, or that nothing that they think they're buying is encroaching onto somebody else's property. Imagine you sell a house to someone and the backyard is fenced in, and they close, and then a week later they come home and one whole side of their fence is missing because it was encroaching on the neighbor's property and the neighbor cut it down. That'd be a bad outcome, right? So you always want to recommend to your clients that they have a survey done so that they can make sure that there are no encroachments. When I got into the business 1,000 years ago, lenders would require you to have a survey done. That is no longer the case. Most lenders now do not require a survey to be done, and here's the reason why. It used to be that title insurance policies did not cover anything that resulted from an encroachment unless you had had a survey done. The only way that title insurance would cover you for encroachments and resolving encroachments was if you had had a survey done. So in order to get title insurance, you had to have a survey done, and the lender required you to have title insurance, so therefore a loan required a survey. The title insurance companies some years ago started to say, you know what, we're gonna add encroachment coverage to our title insurance policies, whether or not the buyer has a survey. So here's what I will tell you. That change has probably happened about 10 years ago now. What that means is that the vast majority of properties that change hands now, there's never a survey done. Because buyers don't want to spend the extra money. It's the nature of $300, $400. And a lot of buyers simply elect not to spend that money. And as time goes on and properties are not surveyed routinely as they change hands, you're going to get more and more encroachments. It's going to become a bigger issue because people are doing things like putting up fences and putting a shed in their backyard or adding on to their garage, and they're doing all these things without having a survey done, and then they sell the property and the buyer comes in and doesn't have a survey done. Sooner or later, these encroachments are going to come to light and then create big problems, and you don't want to be involved in that. Now, can you control the fact that your clients don't have a survey done? Absolutely not. But you can have in writing where you recommended for them to have one done, and they decline to have it. You know, same thing with a home inspection. I have one of my agents who's a new agent, and she came to me the other day and said, I've got an investor client, and they're buying a house, and they know there's problems with it, and they're going to gut it. There's no reason for them to have an inspection, is there? I said, are you asking me from your perspective or from theirs? And she said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, from their perspective, I could see where there'd be no need to have an inspection. You know, they probably feel qualified to evaluate what they're buying, and they feel comfortable with what they're buying. From your perspective, absolutely they need a home inspection, because from your perspective, everybody needs a home inspection. I said, so what that means is you send them an email that says, you know, FYI, even though I know you're going to do a lot of work to the property, I still recommend you have a home inspection done just in case there may be something we've missed. And when they send you an email back that says, no, don't worry about it, I'm not interested in having it, you keep that. And so if and when down the road something comes up, you've got that sort of protection from liability where you actually recommend they have that work done. All right? Any questions on easements as far as encumbrances go? All right, let's shift gears here now and talk about the encumbrance that's always there. The one that never really goes away. The property tax lien. In North Carolina, we call it the ad valorem property tax lien. And ad valorem simply means based on value. That we tax based on value in North Carolina. Your property taxes, the amount, is based on the market value of your property. And this is on page 53, 54 in your textbook, if you're following along there. So the first thing it says about property taxation in North Carolina is it's governed by the Machinery Act. And the Machinery Act is sort of a weird name for something that deals with property tax because it has nothing to do with machinery. It's just the name of the law that sets up how property taxes work in the state of North Carolina. And basically, the Machinery Act says that every property is going to be taxed based on its market value. Well, it also says that we're going to set that market value once every how often? Once every 8 years. That market value is going to be established by the county where the property is located. We call that the octennial reappraisal. So once every 8 years, Wake County, for example, because I live in Cary, is required to come out to my house physically and value it based on what they believe its current market value to be at that point in time. And that's going to remain the market value for how long? 8 years, or the tax assessed value, I should say. It's not going to remain the market value because the market value changes day to day, right? So just because the market value, we hear this all the time. Well, you don't hear it right now, but when the market fell in 2008, 2009, people's tax values were significantly higher than the market value of their house. And the classic line was going to the county and complaining and filing an appeal saying, well, you pay that for it. I'll sell it to you for that amount. They don't care. Because you know what? The same people don't go back now when their property value is 10%, 20% more than that tax value and say, oh, you're not taxing me enough. It never happens that way. So that's why they don't care when your market value is too high based on a market fluctuation. The only focus is, have they valued it correctly at that one point in time once every 8 years? That makes sense for everybody? So when you go and appeal your tax value, you're not appealing it right now. You're appealing it based on when it was valued, whenever that was in that cycle. Now, Wake County just had new tax values established this year. So the next time properties will be reevaluated in Wake County will be 2014. No, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's right, 2014.
2024.
2024, sorry. Gosh. 2024. That's right.
You probably haven't gotten to it yet.
Yep.
Isn't the assessment, isn't that like kind of like a mini appraisal that they can use?
It is. It is, exactly. That's how they assess the value. They go out, and they visit the property, they take pictures of the property, they measure the home.
But don't they do an assessment every year? Isn't that what
they do not?
Okay.
They do not. Once every 8 years.
Okay.
Now, when you sell your house, and we'll say you sell it for 20% more than it was assessed for before.
Yep.
They change the assessment up to what you just paid for.
They do not.
They do not.
They do not. It stays the same for 8 years.
Because in Ohio, they do.
Yeah. No, in North Carolina, it stays exactly the same for 8 years. The only time they would do that is if the home was a new construction home. They set the assessed value at the sales price, whenever it happens in the middle of the cycle. Because obviously, you build a new home in the middle of the cycle, they need an assessed value because previously the assessed value was only the land. And they will reset the assessed value to whatever the sales price was. Wake County does 100% of the sales prices. Some counties do 90% of the sales price. That's a county by county policy thing. But that's the only time that they would change a property's assessed value during that, or if a major improvement was made to the property. Now, if you go and you, for example, add a screen porch onto your house, that's going to change the assessed value of your property. Well, you ask, how do they know? How do they know?
You have to get a permit.
You have to get a permit to have that work done. And why do you have to have a permit?
So they know.
For your safety, of course, right? Not so they know that you've improved your property and that they can tax you more on said property. And by the way, Google Earth is their friend, folks. You know, they have people whose job it is to do nothing but scan pictures of Google Earth to see if there are improvements that are made on property that are not permitted. If you add on, for example, a screen porch or a deck or something that's not permitted, they have people who sit there and actually examine those updated Google Earth images to make sure.
We just built a shed in our backyard that is 11 foot 11 inches square, because after 12 foot square,
You need a permit.
you need a permit.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes, ma'am.
So my cousin is in the middle of building a lower deck on his house,
Uh-huh.
so he has to get a permit for that?
Yes, and if he's in the middle of building it, he's already behind the 8 ball on, remember, permit comes before building, right? Because it's permission to build.
I don't know if he did it or not already, I just thought about it because
Yeah.
I was at his house today.
Is there a post out in front of the house with a big white sign on it? Then he probably didn't get a permit. And he probably didn't get a permit. And you know what? They can come out there and they can tear it down
Or they'll charge you a whole bunch more.
to look at
To
it.
look at
Right. Usually with decks, they won't make you take it down because they can see the actual structure. But, you know, like for example, in Cary, they're super nice. Like if you have your basement finished and you didn't get it permitted, they're super nice. They'll come out and they'll inspect it after the fact and they'll say, you know, it looks good, but we need to check on the plumbing and electrical and make sure everything's okay there. And you say, okay, well, what do you mean the plumbing and electrical is behind the sheetrock? That's right, yeah, just take all the sheetrock down so that we can see the plumbing and the electrical, and then we'll inspect it for you. Oh, that cabinet's in the way? Yeah, you need to rip the cabinets out of the kitchen so we can see that as well. We need to check the insulation as well, so yeah, that sheetrock will have to come down. So you've pretty much disassembled the entire thing so that they can inspect after the fact. It's a big deal to not get permits. But that would be examples of reasons that the assessed value would change somewhere in the middle of that cycle. Outside of some major change to the property itself, though, the assessed value is going to stay the same during that 8-year period. Yes, ma'am?
Are there certain things you have to get permits for when you're doing that, for like in city limits and not in city limits?
Well, it's going to vary from, enforcement's going to vary from city to city. The laws, the rules do not vary from city to
Okay.
city. There's a statewide unified building code that says what you need a permit for. And the answer to that question, when somebody says, do I need a permit, there is one answer that's always correct. You know what that answer is?
Yes.
Yes, you need a permit. Do you know that you need a permit to install a ceiling fan? In the state of North Carolina, that requires a permit. Think about that. To install a ceiling fan, you need a permit in the state of North Carolina. That's what the rule says. There's nothing you can do. Replace a rotten board on your deck, you need a permit for that. That's what state law says. So, do they enforce it that stringently? Certainly not everywhere. I mean, there are some places where you could build a 40 by 40 shed in your backyard, they never say anything about it. There are some places that if you went 12 by 12, they'd be out there in a heartbeat. You know,
For 12 1/4.
yeah, exactly, to measure it and see that you're over and say you need a permit for this. So enforcement might vary from place to place, but the rules do not vary about what requires a permit. Those are statewide. But the answer is generally, yes, you need a permit. All right? So again, we're going to value the property once every 8 years, and that's an individual valuation. The county's going to send out an appraiser to each individual property to individually measure, take pictures, and come up with a valuation for that property. Now, it's a first of all, valuation is always a very inexact science, but the valuation that's done for tax purposes is particularly inexact, because one of the key things that's missing, especially with residential properties, is they never go inside the property for these evaluations. So, two properties that are the exact same size, side by side, in the same neighborhood are going to have the same value. If one has been completely gutted and updated and the other one is still stuck in 1972, do they really have the same value? And the answer is no. Are they going to be taxed at the same value? The answer is yes, they are. Because they never see that to make that comparison. And so it's a very inexact science in that regard. Okay? But it's an individual valuation for each property, happens every 8 years.
Does it only happen, I mean, do they like do some houses every year?
No.
So like once every 8 years?
One county once every 8 years. Now, generally speaking, counties that are adjacent to each other try to stay on different schedules so that the appraisers in the area are not inundated. You know, like for example, Wake was done this year. Durham is next year. Orange is the year 2 years following, I think. You know, so the counties tend to try to work together to stay on alternating schedules so that it's not just a flood of every county being reassessed in the same year. Because there's a limited number of appraisers that go around, and they have to bring in help. And it takes them pretty much a whole year to go through the entire county.
Oh, I should imagine.
Okay. Now, the one other time that the assessed tax value can be adjusted in the middle of that 8-year cycle, and I specifically say in the middle, is something called a horizontal adjustment. Now, this is something that people misunderstand routinely. The octennial reappraisal is an individual thing. I'm going to repeat that. The octennial reappraisal is an individual thing. They go to your house and they come up with a value. They come to my house and they come up with a value. They go to Sabrina's house, they come up with a value. Every property gets its own individual value during the octennial reappraisal. Sometimes, however, the county may want to adjust the tax values of all of the property in a county during the middle of that cycle. That's called a horizontal adjustment. Now, in a horizontal adjustment, they don't visit any property in the county. It's very much not an individual thing. They simply adjust the assessed value of every property in the county up or down by some flat percentage. So, at Wake County at year 4 could say property values have risen by 10% in the last 4 years, and adjust the assessed value of every property up by 10%. So it's, you know, completely an across-the-board flat adjustment for every property if they choose to do a horizontal.
And do they do that to meet their tax liability?
No, I mean, realistically, the assessed value is only half of the picture when it comes to tax liability. It's one of the most misunderstood things in the world. We're going to talk about the math of calculating property taxes. It's one of the most misunderstood things in the world. People get their new assessed values when they reevaluate their home, and they flip out because they assume that their tax liability is going to automatically go up commensurate with the amount that their assessed value goes up. That's almost never the case, because the rate is going to be adjusted to reflect the new higher assessed values. Like, for example, in Wake County, the average increase in value was about 20% from last octennial reappraisal to this one. But their revenue stream only went up by 1% because the tax rate was adjusted downward to offset the now increased assessed values. So they essentially stayed fairly revenue neutral, some modest growth in expenditures. Does that make sense for you?
It does.
So the assessed value is really only one half, and it's the politician's dream. The change in assessed value is the politician's dream, because every one of the Wake County commissioners will run on the fact that we reduced your property taxes because they lowered the rate. But why did they lower the rate? Because the assessed values went up so much that even with a lower rate, they're actually still collecting more revenue than they were before. But we lowered your property tax rates. We're your friends.
You gotta love a politician.
Yes, absolutely. You have to have something to run on, right? Okay? Everybody okay with this? As far as the idea of when the properties are assessed. Now remember, North Carolina uses a 100% market value model. So that assessed value is the market value at the time that assessment's done. Other states may use 50% of market value or 80% of market value. If you get a test question where it says a property is located in Ohio, where the market value is 80%, the market value is $300,000 and the assessed tax value is 80% of market value, which number are you going to use for the math of figuring out the taxes owed on that property?
80%.
You're going to use the 80% of the market value. Does that make sense? You always want to make sure you're using an assessed tax value when you're calculating taxes. Now, this chart is extremely important to know this timeline here. This timeline is very important for you guys to memorize, because you will certainly see this on a test. All right? When are taxes billed? When are they due? And when do they become a lien? All right? Taxes, property taxes, aren't billed generally until late August, early September. That's when you know how much your property tax bill for the year. So my 2016 property taxes have not yet been billed. I do not know what the amount of those taxes are. Now, we're late enough in the year that if I really wanted to know, I could go and look up whatever tax rate the county commissioners have adopted and multiply that by my tax value, and I could come up with it. But even earlier in the year, I couldn't even do that because the tax rate may not be established for the year. Because they have to vote on, even though the assessed value only changes every 8 years, they have to vote on a tax rate every single year. Does that make sense for everybody? The rate itself varies from year to year to year. Well, even though that bill's not going to come out till September, what does it say about when my 2016 taxes actually became a lien on my property?
The beginning of the year.
At the beginning of the year. They're a lien even before the bill exists. It's the only thing I know of that works that way. We don't have a bill, we don't know how much the bill is going to be, but it's already a lien against my property.
So like if you were to sell your house in March,
Mm-hmm.
how do they decide how much property tax is prorated?
So what we do in that case is we assume that the buyer is going to pay. Her question was, if I sell my house in March, how do we prorate the property taxes? Which is a really great question. What we do is we assume that the buyer is going to have to pay all the property taxes later in the year because the bill is going to come out long after the property has been transferred. Does that make sense for everybody? Property gets transferred in March. Bill doesn't come out till September. Who owns the property at that point in time? It's the buyer. And so they're going to pay, they're going to be responsible for paying the entire bill. So the way we handle that at closing is to have the seller pay their fair share of the taxes, but not pay it to the county, pay it to the buyer themselves. They give the buyer the money in advance, and it's up to the buyer to pay the taxes later in the year.
But how do they know how much to pay?
We base it on last year's taxes, which is an imprecise, imperfect method. You know, if it's early enough in the year that we don't know the new tax rate, we would simply base it on last year's rate and this year's assessed value. If we were at the octennial reappraisal. The nice thing about when the octennial reappraisal comes out is that the assessed values come out in the year before. So my assessed value is up this, went up this year, but I actually got that notice in November of last year. So I've known since November of last year what my new assessed value was. So they do have half of the equation. So they can use the previous year's rate with the new assessed value and estimate the taxes in that way. And obviously it's going to be imperfect, but we call it close enough for horseshoes and hand grenades and move on. Okay? So, they've already become a lien on January 1 of this year, even though they're not going to be billed till September of this year. And they are delinquent if we get to January 6th of next year without them being paid. So if my 2016 property taxes are not paid by January the 6th, so the last day I can pay them is January the 5th of 2017. If we get to January 6, 2017 and they remain unpaid, they are delinquent. Now most people do not wait quite that late to pay them because that's a tax deductible expenditure. Your property taxes, whether it's an investment property or a home, are going to be tax deductible in one way or another. If it's an investment property, it's a tax deduction against the income the property produces. If it's a home, it's a tax deduction, a personal tax deduction. And so most people want to be able to take that tax deduction this year, when they do their this year's taxes. So they want to pay them before December 31st. But technically they have until January 5th to get them paid. And very few people pay them in September. All right, any questions about that calendar? All good with that? So now it's time to introduce you to my good friend, Mr. T, the T-bar. Now, how many of you are fans of solving equations algebraically? Okay, feel free to do so. There's no reason you can't solve equations algebraically anytime you want to. Okay, I will never tell you not to do it. What I will tell you is I don't teach it that way because the vast majority of people don't want to do it algebraically. And that's where the T-bar comes into play. The T-bar, folks, is just a visual representation of a formula that allows you to quickly solve the formula without having to think so much. Okay? So when you look at a T-bar, this is how you should see it. The T-bar always has three sort of factors. One on top and two on the bottom. Does everybody see that? Okay? And where you see the lines in the T-bar, you sort of imagine these symbols right here. Well, that's divide and that's multiply, correct? So, if you have the two numbers on the bottom of a T-bar formula, you would multiply them to get the top number. If you have the top number and bottom number, what would you do with those two things? Divide to get the other bottom number. So the way you use a T-bar is simply to find the thing you're looking for, circle it, and then you use the other two items to find your solution. Does that make sense for everybody? So it's just a quick way to solve an equation. Now, here's where I'm going to say, keep it simple, stupid. How many of you have ever heard the KISS rule, right? Keep it simple, stupid. Whatever is on top here is the first number you press into your calculator. I don't care if it's a bigger number or a littler number. Is littler a word? Probably not, but in this context it works. Because for some reason, y'all have like this constitutional, refusal to divide a small number by a big number sometimes. Yes, you can do it. I promise your calculator will not melt in your hands if you divide 3,000 by 300,000. It works. And it's the way you have to do it if that's what the formula says. Okay? I cannot tell you how many people sit there and memorize the T-bar and then don't do what the daggum thing says to do. It doesn't do any good if you don't follow the instructions of the T-bar. Okay? So here is a simple T-bar formula. Area equals length times width, right? And last night I believe y'all did a little bit of this with acreage math, right? Area equals length times width. Well, said another way, if I was looking for width, what does the T-bar say I need to do to solve for width?
Divide the area by the length. Area
divided by length, right? And if I wanted to solve for length, it would be area divided by width. Okay? And an example of that would be here. Width of 100, length of 150. Those two times each other equals 15,000. 15,000 divided by 100 equals 150. 15,000 divided by 150 equals 100. It all works out that way. Okay? Now let's look at it for property taxes. This is the T-bar formula for property taxes. And let me take just a second. You've got this in your notes as well, but I want to give you, this is something I would put in the back of your binder and keep handy at all times, because these are, I believe, all the formulas you will need in the entire class set up into T-bars for you. Okay? So you'll have them as sort of a quick reference guide as we go through. And I'll always have a slide for it, but it's kind of hard to go back and find a formula in the middle of your notes. So I'm trying to give them to you all in one spot for quick reference here. But if you look up on the slide up there, you've got the formula for property tax now. The formula for property taxation in North Carolina is the property tax bill is equal to the assessed value times the North Carolina tax rate. Okay? So what you need to do is just memorize that. You need to memorize that formula. You need to memorize that when I'm working with property taxes, this is the formula I'm going to use. So as we get to the math in this class, one of the things I'd like you to practice is showing your work. Nothing frustrates me more than coming around and trying to help you with math and seeing a blank sheet of paper with a wrong answer written down on it. I have no earthly idea what you did. I can't help, right? And more importantly, you can't help yourself because you have no idea what you did. And even if you've got the right answer, you may not be able to reproduce that right answer the next time, because when you come back to study it, there's nothing to study. There's just a number on a piece of paper. Does that make sense for everybody? So you need to work on showing your math. Take the time to write down the formula. Write the T-bar down. When you see a property tax math question, no matter how well you know how to do it, write that T-bar down so that when you come back and study it 3 weeks from now, you're like, oh, okay, yep, I know exactly what I did here. This is why I did it. This is how I got to my answer. Makes sense. So if you'll start doing that now, it'll help a lot. So as soon as you see it's a property tax math question, you should write this formula down. All right? Now, in North Carolina, we have tax rates that are stated in dollars per $100 of value. That's the way the state chooses to give us our property tax rate. It's a dollars per 100. Well, the good news for you is your calculator has a dollars per 100 button on it, and they didn't tell you about it. Anybody want to guess what button that is? The percent button, because a dollars per 100, or really anything per 100, just means, how many cents are there in a dollar? 100. So percent means per 100, right? So the percent button is your friend here, because a North Carolina tax rate in this example of $1.50 per 100 is the same as 1.5%. Does that make sense for everybody? You just drop the dollar sign and you put a percent sign at the end. Is everybody with me on that? So when I'm plugging things into my calculator, I can type that in 2 different ways. When I'm using that percent, I can use it without the percent sign, which means I have to convert it to a decimal. So if I'm converting to a decimal, I have to move the decimal 2 places to the left, or divide by 100, which is the same thing. Or I can do the shortcut method and just say 1.5%. Does that make sense for everybody? Now the only catch is, on most calculators, when you press the percent button, you don't also need to press the equals button. The percent button takes care of equals for you. So if you do, $300,000 times 1.5%, as soon as you hit the percent button, it's going to throw the answer up there. If you hit the equals button, it's going to do it again. It runs it for a second time. So just know that about calculators and the percent button. All right? Now, here's an example. Property taxation. What is the yearly tax bill for a property with an assessed value of $220,000 in Chapel Hill, where the tax rate is $1.76 per 100? Well, what are they asking us for, first of all, in this question?
The tax bill.
The tax bill. So they're asking us for the thing on the top of the T-bar, which means we need to take, what's our final answer going to be? In words, not numbers.
The value times the rate.
The value, the assessed property value, times the rate. Okay? So what did they give us as the assessed value here? $220,000. And what is the rate? 1.76%. Now, even though I typed it on the slide opposite here, you really should put the value first and then the rate, because your calculator doesn't like the percent button when you do it as the first number. So you should put the value in first, 220,000 times 1.76%. Is everybody's calculator working okay for that? Good. Good. $3,872 would be your annual tax bill in that case, $3,872. Okay? In this question, they're asking us for the rate. So what does the T-bar tell us we're going to do when we're being asked for the rate? Tax bill divided by value. Absolutely. And in this case, they gave us the tax bill of $2,350, and they gave us the value for the property of $275,000. So that's going to be $2,350 divided by $275,000. Now, here's the secret. You're going to get a number that's very minuscule here. Okay? That's your tax rate stated as a decimal. So I'm going to give you a trick. Anytime you're calculating the rate in one of these formulas, because almost all of our formulas have a rate of some type in them, if you're being asked for the rate, when you get your final answer from the T-bar, just multiply times 100. Just get in the habit of, when you calculate the rate, hit times 100 at the end. So your rate here is actually going to be 0.85%, which is the same thing as 85 cents per 100. That makes sense for everybody?
I guess if you're in doubt, you can always back it out
Yes.
if you need to.
You can certainly back it out and make sure it works, right?
If 0.85% times the rate,
Yep. And whereas if you do 0.0085% times the rate, it's obviously not going to give, it's going to give you $38 and, you know. And if you did 85% times the rate, it's going to give you a really big number. Make sense for everybody so far? Okay. This one wants to know the total assessed value of a property where you've got a city tax rate and a county tax rate. So if you have a city tax rate and a county tax rate, which rate is the property going to be subject to? Both. That's exactly right. So to utilize the formula in a question like this, what do you think you have to do with those two tax rates? Add them together. You've got to combine them. Absolutely. So in this case, our rate is going to be 75 cents per 100 plus 28 cents per 100. And it really is just 75 cents plus 28 cents. Don't make that harder than it needs to be, right? So 0.75 plus 0.28 gives you a rate of $1.03 per 100 or 1.03%. Right? So that 1.03% right here is going to be the number that you plug in for the rate here. And the value is, of course, equal to the bill divided by the rate. It gave you the bill of $31.80 divided by the rate of 0.0103 or 1.03%, whichever way you want to type it in your calculator. I like the 1.03%. That's the way I usually do it. And it's going to give you an assessed value of $308,000 and change. On number 8 there, which is where I told you to stop off for just a second, we have mill rates. Mill rates look a lot more complex than they are. It's just a different way of giving a tax rate. It's the way that some other states state their tax rate. Rather than doing a percentage, they do it in millions. Percentages are hundreds, mill rates are millions. The only thing you need to know there is that it's easy to convert a mill rate to a North Carolina tax rate. And you already know how to use the North Carolina tax rate. You just learned the formula for how to use the North Carolina tax rate. So rather than try to reinvent the wheel and teach you how to do tax math with mill rates, what I teach you to do is just go ahead and convert that mill rate to a North Carolina tax rate. Does that make sense for everybody? You already know how to work with the North Carolina tax rate, which is just a straight percentage. Just go ahead and convert that mill rate into a North Carolina tax rate. And we've got a T-bar for that, which I've given you. So it's just the North Carolina tax rate times what? 10. Gives you the mill rate. So for example, in this case, a North Carolina tax rate of $1.25 per 100, you multiply that times 10, your mill rate is 12.5, right? So look at that number 8 on your questions right there. Number 8 says, in question 7 above, what is the mill rate? Well, you should have come up with a tax rate, a North Carolina tax rate of $2.35-ish cents per 100. $2.34, $2.35 per 100. Is everybody there on that rate now that I've been around with everybody? So if we want to convert that to a mill rate, what do we need to do? Multiply it by 10. So if we multiply $2.35 per 100 times 10, our mill rate is 23.5, 23.5. That's literally how complex mill rates are.
So it's just moving the decimal point.
It's just moving the decimal point. That's exactly right. Just moving the decimal point.
Okay, just do that to confuse people.
They do, right? You know, I've always thought dollars per hundred was a stupid way to state it. I think percentage just makes more sense. Why not say it's 1.3%, right? Because percent is a universal language. You say dollars per hundred and people have no idea what you're talking about. Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry.
So the answer to number 7 was what?
The answer to number 7 was $2.35 per 100. Did you get that on the second time through?
No, I think I forgot what you said.
Okay, let me do that one real quick then, okay? On number 7, we want to make sure we got it. On number 7, it says Michigan values property for taxation purposes at 65% of market value. Now remember, we don't really care about market value in the property tax equation. What kind of value do we care about? Assessed value, right? So what they've told us is that the market value of the property is $255,000. But, thought I had a better one. We want to get to an assessed value for the same property. What does it tell us about the relationship between the market value and the assessed value in Michigan?
65%.
That the assessed value is 65% of the market value. So $255,000 times 65% is 65. Yeah, 65% should give you your assessed value of how much? I got 165,750.
Yep.
Now, I'm ready to plug that into my T-bar. Remember, my T-bar looks like this, dollar tax bill over assessed value and rate. And they're asking me for the rate. So I know I need tax bill divided by assessed value. And they gave me a tax bill of $38.95 annually, divided by my assessed value of $165,750, right? And I come up with 0.02349, I think, without rounding. Now remember, anytime you're calculating the rate, what do you do immediately as soon as you get the number out of your calculator? Multiply it by 100, which is going to give you 2.349%, right? Or $2.349 per 100, however you want to state it. Good?
Which shouldn't even be 65% in Michigan.
It should not be 65%.
No, yeah, dirt roads in Michigan.
Yes, a lot of
Bunches of
them, and particularly up in the north, yeah.
We lived on a dirt road off of a dirt road,
Did you? What part of Michigan?
just outside Detroit.
Just out, we're in Detroit.
Hmm?
We're outside of Detroit.
Belleville.
I have family in Fraser.
Oh, yeah.
You know where that is, Roseville, that area. Macomb County.
Yeah, yeah.
That is.
Belleville was between Detroit and Ann Arbor.
Okay, so yeah, I know exactly where that is. All right, is everybody good on mill rates? Good. Okay, you got another slide about mill rates here, but again, same thing, same idea. And you've got some examples in there, which we don't need to go through, I don't think, in your slides. Any questions about calculating property taxes so far?
Will they try to mix you up as far as the terminology on the exams?
No, it's pretty straightforward. They
So
will, you know,
if you know your math, you can
if you know your math, you can figure it out. The big key is knowing the difference between market value and assessed value.
Okay.
Make sure you're using the assessed value, because they will usually give you both, and you have to sort through which one you need.
Okay.
And judging by one of the questions in the back of the book, they may tell you what the city rate and the county rate is, but it's only in the
But
county.
you only need one, yes. They may give you a question that says, you know, a property is located outside the municipal limits of Cary, the Wake County property tax rate is 99 cents per 100 and the Cary City tax rate is 25 cents per 100. Well, you see two tax rates and your inclination is to add them together, but the key was it said it was located where? Outside the municipal limits of Cary, which means it's not going to be subject to that city rate, it's only going to be subject to the county rate. So that's sort of the gotchas they may throw in there, you know, as if you need gotchas on math, but they will. They will. Well, here's what I'll tell you. A lot of what they play with on the math, believe it or not, is having the decimal in the wrong place. So apply some common sense, right? The tax bill is not going to be more than the value of the property. If you're doing the math and the tax bill comes out to be a bigger number than the whole value of the property, you got a decimal in the wrong place somewhere. You know, the tax bill is not going to be $25 a year. If you come out to that answer, you got a decimal in the wrong place somewhere. You know, most tax rates are going to be pretty close to 1% in most questions, you know, so look for an answer that's in that neighborhood, you know, and a lot of the math questions, common sense will take you a long way, you know. For example, I had a person one time and she just couldn't grasp profit and loss math, right? You know, she couldn't remember the formula, she could never get it right, and she had this test question and she got it wrong, and I just looked at her and I said, Tammy, think for a second, because the question said, you know, Bob bought a property for $80,000 and he sold it 3 years later for $150,000. What was his rate of profit on the sale? Well, what did he practically do?
Doubled his money.
Double his money. When you double your money, you make 100% profit, right? Well, the answer choices were 10% profit, it was like 9% profit, 90% profit, 900% profit, and then some completely random number. I'm like, you didn't even have to pick up a calculator to answer that question because there's only one number that was remotely close to possible. You see what I mean? So you should always apply a common sense metric to your math answers too. Does this make sense given the context of the question? All right? Nope. You know, when we get later on in the class and you're doing the income, approach to value, if your net operating income annually is more than the value of the property, you did something wrong. You know, like there's no way a property's worth less than the income it produces on an annual basis. That's just not possible, right? Okay? Now, we'll slide through these because we've done enough examples already. That's it. End of my slides here. One thing I do want to point out, and I didn't put a slide here at the very end for it, on page 57, you've got special assessments. Make sure you understand what a special assessment is. A special assessment in North Carolina is a tax that's been levied against your property for an improvement that the government has made on your property. Somebody somewhere in a seat of authority decided your property needed to be improved.
Needed some sidewalks.
You needed sidewalks, you needed street lights, you needed, for example, maybe you were out in the country and you have a septic tank and they decided you need access to the city sewer system. Whether you want it or not, you need it. And they're going to give it to you, but you're going to pay for it. That is a special assessment. And that is levied by your local taxing authority, and it sits up there in that same sort of high lien priority as taxes do as well. But it's an improvement made to your property by the government. And that's it for Chapter 3.